Talofa, welcome back. We're ready to move into Module 2. Now, if you're working on these modules sequentially, you've just finished Module 1, in which we talked about problem formulation. So let's go back to the diagram and have a quick review. Now, if you recall from the first module, this diagram describes the process of problem formulation. Remember that we said that before we start designing what the project is going to do, we have to first have a clear understanding of the problem that we want to solve with the project. We need good problem formulation. Now, in the first module, we discussed 2 of 3 steps involved in problem formulation. The first step, as you can see here, is to identify the strategy linkages. Remember that we said that we don't fish projects out of the sea. We don't pull them out of the sky, but we take projects from existing strategies and policies. So this first step ensures that your project is linked to existing climate change strategies, plans, and policies, because your country's climate change priorities are in these plans. Now, the second step is to develop the climate change evidence base for the project. And if you recall, we used the impact chain analysis tool to do this. Now, the evidence base demonstrates that the project being addressed by the project is a climate change problem and not a development problem. And in the first module, remember, we understood the very important distinction or difference between climate change problems and development problems. And we know that this is essential to designing a fundable concept note and project. So now, as you can see on the bottom here, in this module, we're going to focus on the non-climate factors that shape the problem. These are the factors that serve to make people, places, things more vulnerable to climate change impacts. They may be social, cultural, economic, or political factors. We're also going to be looking at gaps and barriers that keep the problem from being solved. But before we get into the technical aspects, I'd like to tell you a personal story that I think really highlights the importance of good problem formulation and also illustrates some of the hazards of bad problem formulation. So in this picture, you can see me in my younger days, a number of years ago, with my young daughter. Now, we live in Hawaii, and Hawaii is a chain of islands in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, as you can see from the map. Now, like I said, this picture was taken a number of years ago when my daughter was young. She was 5 years old in this picture. So we've always enjoyed walking along the beach, and this picture was taken in the midst of a walk along the beach. Now, Hawaii is a beautiful place, but like all beautiful places, it has its problems. One of the biggest issues we face is homelessness or houselessness. Now, homeless people in Hawaii set up temporary or informal shelters wherever they can find space. It could be under highway flyovers or in parks, or often on the beach. Now, you may be familiar with problems like this in large cities where people set up informal settlements wherever they can find space. So one day long ago, my daughter and I, remember she was 5 years old, we were walking along the beach, and she noticed the people living on the beach. And she asked me, "Daddy, why are there people living on the beach?" "Well," I said, "because they don't have houses." Now, anyone that has ever dealt with a 5-year-old or has any experience with small children, like 5-year-olds, knows that the conversation does not stop there. "Why don't they have houses?" she asked. "Well, because there aren't enough houses for everyone," I said. And you could probably predict what came next. She asked me, "Well, why aren't there enough houses for everyone?" And the why questions kept coming. very quickly. And I found myself trying to explain complex issues of macroeconomics and housing policy and land tenure to a 5-year-old. All of these complex issues that contribute to the problem of homelessness. My 5-year-old's questions also challenged me to really explore my understanding of the problem and to really think about the complex nature of homelessness in Hawaii. Now, it's really hard to imagine or to think about even trying to solve this complex problem without exploring and understanding the complexity and all of these driving factors. On the other hand, sometimes people come up with overly simple solutions to complex problems. So you may have heard a simpler explanation for the problem of homelessness or houselessness. You may have heard people claim that homelessness is a result of people being lazy. They say that people are homeless because they're lazy. But this is a simple explanation for a complex problem. And most of us recognize that the problem of homelessness is much more complex than that. And indeed, most of the issues that we deal with society are very complex issues, and they're hard to solve. If they were easy to solve, they would have been solved by now. So usually we reject an oversimplification like that because we really want to understand the complex nature of these problems so that we can solve them. But let's just assume for a minute that we believe that we have a homeless problem because people are lazy. So by this logic, if this is true, all we have to do is address laziness or the problem of people being lazy. And if we can do that, well, then we won't have homelessness anymore. So let's think about this, and we design a project. That would be our next step. And the project objective or the goal of the project would be to make people not be lazy. Now, however you could do that, that's what our project would be. It could be that we force people to work, or maybe we have other activities that encourage people to work. And we design the project, and we get funding for it from a financier, from a funder. Then we spend money and time and energy and resources, and we implement this project with the objective of making people not be lazy. But at the end of the project implementation, you can probably guess what will happen. We will still have the problem of homelessness and houselessness. That's because we solved the wrong problem. We didn't have good problem formulation. We didn't understand the complexity of the issue, the direct causes and the indirect causes, and all of these factors that cause homelessness or contribute to homelessness, and we didn't address those. Instead, we came up with a simple solution. We came up with a simple answer. We designed a simple project, and as a result, our project failed. Now, this is a very extreme example. But I'm sure that you can think of some real-world examples of projects that did not achieve all that they expected to achieve, or even projects that have totally 100% completely failed. And there are many reasons why this might happen. Yeah, it could be poor management. Sometimes projects fail because they're not managed very well. Or there could be poor stakeholder buy-in, or there could be some sort of corruption. But one of the most common reasons that projects fail is because they don't have good problem formulation. They don't address the true complexity of the problem that they're trying to solve. So this happens often when project designers try to design a project before understanding the complexity of the problem. So I think that you can understand, or you can begin to understand, why I like to spend so much time on understanding the complexity of the problem that I'm trying to solve with a project before I even think about what the project is going to do. So you may have noticed that by this point that we haven't even started to talk about what our project is going to do. We're still focusing on problem identification, and that's very good practice to make sure that you understand the complexity of the problem. The teams that I generally work with, we spend more time doing background research and conducting consultations and validating and verifying our assumptions and examining the problem before we start thinking about how to solve it. So in this module, we're going to use an extremely powerful tool to explore the complexity of the problem. This tool will help us to uncover and understand the direct and the indirect causes and the impacts of the problem. It will also help us to map out the gaps and the barriers that keep the problem from being solved, that make the problem persistent, that make it difficult. And this technique will also help us to identify the entry points where we may be able to exercise some influence to make a change in the problem, to make a positive change, so that the problem is not a problem anymore. And this understanding will inform what we call our theory of change, which we'll cover in Module 4. And it will help us decide exactly what our project needs to do to address the problem. Now, before I go any further, what I'll tell you is that if you have very good problem identification, and if you spend time to do rigorous problem identification, the project almost designs itself. It makes it much easier to design a good, effective project. So the technique that we're going to use is called the problem tree. And as you can see with the diagram that we're looking at here, this is the problem tree. Now, the problem tree is not a new technique, and it's not exclusive to climate change. It's a tried and tested methodology for mapping out complexity. It's used by everyone. It's used by the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the World Bank, the United Nations. Project designers all over the world use the problem tree because it's so useful. It's a good thinking tool. And it helps us to understand all the factors that cause people to be vulnerable to the impacts of climate change that you described in the impact chain analysis. Now, the basic technique is to identify the core problem, which you can see is a trunk of our problem tree here. First we identify our core problem, and you've already done that from Module 1. But then we want to look at the roots of the core problem. And so we look at our direct causes of the problem. We ask why, like my 5-year-old daughter. We ask why the core problem persists. And that will help us to reveal the driving causes and then the direct causes. And then we'll continue to ask why questions until we understand the indirect causes. And we'll also we'll look at the direct effects and also the indirect effects. Now, eventually, this problem tree technique, it will help us to identify the factors that we can change. I call these the leverage points or control knobs. So once we look at that, we may not be able to change everything in the roots, but if we do good, rigorous problem identification, we will identify some points that we can change. Now, in this introductory video, I'm not going to demonstrate the problem tree technique because we have another video that we've created in the module, and we'll give you we'll step through a problem tree. And we use the problem tree to make the connection between our impact chain analysis, which you've already done, and the impact chain analysis establishes our climate change linkage and the theory of change, which describes how and why our project is going to work. So let's have a look at another diagram. So another way to think about a project or a concept note is to think about it as a way to answer a series of questions from your financier or your funder. Now, in this diagram, we've simplified the steps to designing a project, starting with the problem identification. And we've laid this out as a series of questions. So as we said earlier in the first module, we learned about how to identify the problem or the subject to address with our project. So we use the policy review tool, and we also use the impact chain analysis tool. Now in this module, we are looking at why the problem is persistent, why the problem has not been solved yet. Because remember, when you're asking the funder for money or for support, you're asking them to help you solve a problem that you are not able to solve on your own. And that's the essence of a climate change problem. A climate change problem is a new problem that you're not able to address on your own. Now, in this module, we are looking at why the problem is persistent. So we use the problem tree analysis, and that will inform the gaps and barriers analysis and the concept note template. So the problem tree analysis directly informs your concept note template, the form that you have to fill out, the application form. So moving on in the next few modules, we'll be answering additional questions with additional tools. Why will your project work? This informs the theory of change. The theory of change explains why you think your project will work. And we'll work on that in Module 4. But once we have those questions answered, then, and only then, will we start to work on the logical framework. Now, you've probably heard of the logical framework, and you may be eager to start developing the logical framework. The logical framework is the structure or the blueprint for your project. It's the activities. It's the specific things that your project is going to do. And it answers the question, how will your project work? But remember, before we do that, we have to make sure that we have a good problem identification and a good theory of change. So by the time you finish this module, you'll understand how to do the problem tree. So you'll also understand how to identify the direct and indirect drivers of your problem and what your leverage points are. So that's it for this introductory video. Thank you for your attention. Make sure that you check out the GCF video, because they give you some great advice, great tips directly from the funder. Do the self-guided presentation, because that's why you're here. Watch the demonstration video on the problem tree, where we go step by step through an example problem, through a hypothetical problem, and we'll show you exactly how to do this. Do the exercises in the module, and you can also work up a concept note, for a problem tree for your own concept note. Check out the links and the resources included with the module, because there's lots of good material in the links. And remember, sometimes you just have to think like a 5-year-old. That's it. Good luck. Kamsahamnida, and we will see you in the next module.